Okay, guys, my big question from chapter 9 is why is Maxwell so afraid of Jeff and Mike Sinclair, the boys that he said are mean? So this is chapter 10, Shattering Glass. Evan started running down the driveway. Grandma would be easy to spot, he was sure. She was wearing a dark green coat that would stand out like a flag with all the white snow blanketing the ground. He wished he could follow her tracks, but Jesse and Maxwell and Pete and Evan had made so many footprints since yesterday, it was impossible to make sense out of the mismatch that covered the driveway. And what if she hadn't stuck to the driveway? What if she was in the woods and spread out on both sides? Evan ran past Little Pond, looking left and right. The woods were shaded and filled with the shifting shadows of brown and green cast by tall pine trees. The sun was low in the sky, and the woods seemed to be sprouting strange shapes right before his eyes. If Grandma had stopped to sit down, if she was hurt and lying on the ground surrounded by the thickness and silence of those trees, he would never see her. He started to run faster. He thought of calling out, but a voice inside told him not to. Maybe Grandma had forgotten who he was again. Maybe she would be afraid of him. If she heard his voice calling, she might hide, and then he would never find her. The thought banged against the inside of his skull with every crashing step he took. It was cold and it was getting dark. She was old and didn't remember things right. People died up here in the mountains. Kids lost in a snowstorm. Grown-ups when their cars broke down. Hikers who left the trails and became disoriented. Evan had heard the stories. People died up here. Evan kept running. The driveway was long and curved and stretched for over half a mile before reaching the road. He was breathing hard, and each breath felt like a rusty knife sawing through his lungs. His eyes stung from the cold, and 2 puddles of snot collected under his nostrils, but he kept running toward the road. How far could she have gotten? As far as the road? She was wearing a dark green coat. No one would be able to see that coat if she was walking on the side of the road after dark. What if a car came around and curved too fast? When Evan reached the big rock, he heard a car, the crunch and grind of its wheels as it turned from the main road onto the driveway. Mom! Evan would have screamed if his throat weren't so dry and raw from running in the cold. He waved his arms wildly, running toward the road. But it wasn't his mother's car, it was Pete's truck, and Pete rolled down his window to find out why Evan was acting like a crazy person in the middle of the road, breathing hard, trying to keep up from crying. Evan explained. Pete listened seriously. Okay, first thing, let's call your mom. She doesn't have her cell phone with her. She left it at home, and I don't know exactly where she is, somewhere in town, meeting with an insurance agent. Pete nodded his head slowly, letting this information sink in. All right, then, here's the plan. Someone needs to stay at the house. Can you do that? Can you be the person who answers the phone if anyone calls and who waits there in case your grandmother comes back on her own? Evan nodded his head. I'll call the police and they'll pull together a search. When's your mom expected back? Evan shook his head. She said by dinner time. I think I better drive into town and track her down, said Pete. If she gets back before I do, have her call me on my cell phone, okay? Okay. Evan was glad Pete was here, giving orders. Still, nothing Pete had said so far made Evan feel like Grandma was any closer to being found. I'll take you back to the house, said Pete. No, I'll walk, said Evan. He wanted Pete to go get his mother as soon as possible, and there was nothing waiting back at the house for him. Evan was sure of that. Pete backed up the truck to the road and then spun the wheel and roared off. Evan started walking slowly toward the house. With every step he took, he became more convinced that Grandma was out in the woods and in the falling darkness, out in the cold, and he couldn't help feeling that it was his fault. He should have convinced her not to go for a walk. He should have walked her into waiting with him in the mudroom. He should have found his boots more quickly. Heard her leaving, figured out which way she'd gone, not been the one she forgot, the one she didn't like. When Evan got back to the house, he went first to the barn. No one was there. Then he stood in the front yard, the last place Grandma had been seen, and stared at the house. No lights were on. Grandma wasn't back. Pete had told him to wait inside. That was his job. And over the last few days, Pete had taught him the importance of each man doing his job and doing it well. But what if Grandma had gone to the bell? What if the bell had called to her? That's what Grandma said. Sometimes things called to her, and she had to follow their voices. A bird, a cluster of irises, the pond, the moon. All these things called to Grandma from time to time, and she always went when she was called. Evan dove into the woods, finding the path that led through the trees to Lovell's Hill. The sun was dipping below Black Bear Mountain, and everything had gone flat and gray, but Evan knew the path. He hurried until he made it to the top of the steep rise where the old oak crossbeam stood. Evan looked around. Black Bear Mountain rose behind him like a giant tidal wave. The trees looked like soldiers guarding a gate. The snow under his feet seemed to deaden all around, and the cold was beginning to creep up into his boots and snake its way up his leg. Evan stared at the crossbeam, empty like an eye socket. Grandma wasn't here. The bell wasn't here. Nothing was the way it was supposed to be. Nothing was ever going to be the way it was supposed to be. Evan had that feeling that he got sometimes, that out of nowhere feeling of missing his dad. His dad was supposed to be here in an emergency, but his dad wasn't here and hadn't been for a long time. Sometimes he sent emails with pictures attached to all of the places he traveled for work, and sometimes he sent gifts, a felt hat from Pakistan, or a tiny bottle made out of blue glass from Afghanistan. But Evan hadn't seen his dad in almost a year, and suddenly Evan knew who it was he needed to help him find Grandma. It wasn't his father. It wasn't his mother. He needed someone who would treat it like a math problem, who would keep a clear head, someone who would be able to solve the puzzle. He needed Jesse. Evan knew the way to Maxwell's house and figured he could be there in 10 minutes if he ran the whole way. But as he turned to head down the hill, the air splintered with sound. First a scream and then the noise of shattering glass. The sound came from the direction of the little bridge that crossed Deer Brook. Evan started to run.